Chapter 6 is pretty straightforward, not a lot of math or anything in it, not a bunch of graphs. But it basically goes through some of the options that we have on figuring out the value of the environment or of environmental resources. This is important for policymakers because, as we saw in previous chapters, sometimes you need to understand that value or what people are willing to pay for a resource, so that you can then build that into policies like tax policies or permitting costs and things like that. So, what are the tools at our disposal for figuring out the value of certain environmental resources? Some people have tried it. So your book goes through a couple of examples of studies where people have tried to put together what the value of different um, ecosystems are, or different environmental resources. So here's some examples. Um, but it really sort of depends on what type of value we're trying to measure. And there's really the total economic value is summed up in this nice picture here. There are use values, so values that you get from using a resource, and there are non-use values, values you get from a resource even if you don't sort of actively use it. And then within the use values, there are direct use values that are those sort of obvious timber, non-timber, hiking, hunting. You actually went and you used the resource and you got value from it, right? And then there are indirect use values where you get some value from the resource just sort of being there. You use it without actively having to use it. So soil erosion control, flood protection, things like that, that are provided maybe by a forest or a wetland being near your house. That in that sense you use the resource, but you didn't have to do anything actively to use it. So that's value. The value you get from that is an indirect use value. And then over on the non-use value side, you have what is the value of something just being there, whether you use it or not, right? And so we divide that into three categories. Again, one is the option value. So sometimes you have value just knowing something's there if you want to use it. So maybe I don't care about going hunting today, but I think maybe one day when I retire, I'd like to hunt. So I place value on the fact that that undeveloped land, that forest is there, that I'll have the option to use it later. And then there's the bequest value, which is similar, but in this case, it's not that I care about using it later, but I like that it's there in case my kids or grandkids want to use it. So I get value out of knowing that this resource will be available for future generations. And then the third one is just existence value. So I may not use it, my kids may not use it, but just the idea that it's there brings value to me. I like knowing that the forests exist in the world, whether I ever go for a walk or go hunting or go use the forest ever at all. I get some value just from knowing that they exist. So how we calculate value depends on how we define value, and really to know the full value of something, we would have to be able to get at all of these types of value. And add them up, right? So I may have some, if I am thinking about my personal value of a forest land, I may value it in all of these different ways. And so to know my total value, you'd have to add up each of those types for me, and then you'd have to do that for every consumer to figure out the total economic value of that forest or that resource. So how do we value things? One way, and this is the example shown here in this picture, is we value things based on people's revealed preferences. So, well, let me back up. So your book doesn't spend a whole lot of time on the first few types of value. One is market valuation. So if it's a good like timber that we actually can buy and sell, then the market will give us a value, right? So the market will give us a price or a value for it. Another is the cost of illness method. So you can read about all of these in this chapter. The cost of illness is something like air pollution that causes people health effects, asthma, or whatever health issues that may be caused by certain things. If we add up the total cost of that illness, so the healthcare cost, medical cost, because of that, um, that environmental resource being depleted, then we can come up with a valuation for eliminating pollution, right? Um, so if we, how much does pollution cost us in terms of medical costs, and that may be how much we're willing to pay to get it to go away. And another is replacement cost method. So how much would it cost to replace that environmental resource if it were depleted. So you can think about something like an oil spill that damages a wetland, for example. What does it cost us to replace that wetland back to what it was before it was damaged? And that can give us some sense of the value. So now to this picture. This picture is an example of what's called revealed preference method. So in economics, we talk about revealed preferences as how people show us how much they value something just by their behavior. So one of the ways that people reveal their preference for an environmental resource, a national park, for example, something like that, is by traveling to experience it. So if I'm willing to pay $80 for a trip to the state park down the road for the day, um, then clearly that park is worth at least $80 to me. So that gives us a lower bound of what things are worth to people. If we think about how far did people travel this year to go to Yellowstone, for example. So this is one of the reasons that when you visit a historical site or a national park, a lot of times they have you sign a sign-in book and you write in your zip code, because they're taking stock of this kind of thing. You can measure from someone's zip code how far they traveled and approximately how much they paid for to travel, um, to get there. And from that, you get some revelation. They have then, through their behavior, revealed to you their preference for Yellowstone, right? How much is it worth to me for Yellowstone to be there? Well, at least as much as I'm willing to pay to travel there. Um, so revealed preference methods uh, show us a lot about just watching people's behavior. They sort of reveal to you what something is worth to them, right? Um, so then uh, another way to measure people's value of something is the stated preference method. So you ask them. There are a lot of issues with this, of course, because people may not really know exactly how much they value something. They may have never thought about it before. They may not give you a truthful answer because maybe they have some sort of policy motive in their answer. If you ask, are you willing to pay $100 to keep the rainforest? They may say yes, even if they aren't technically, if you were actually asking them to pay you $100, they may not do it, but they'd say yes because they think what you're really asking is, do you value the rainforest? Right. So they may have some policy motives in their answers, um, or some other sort of issues, as you can imagine, and you can read more about with asking people how much do you value something. But there are several different ways to ask the question, as is shown here in this picture. Different types of questions, survey questions or interview questions that would sort of get at how much do you value this resource. So you can ask in several different ways and kind of get at that answer. But there is a lot of controversy over whether this is really a good method for finding out people's value of things. And really people sort of land on it's useful information, but you need more. It's not enough. So don't take this information alone and say go to court with it in order to argue for how much someone should pay for damages or something like that. So this is not necessarily an end all be all, um, for figuring out people's value, which neither is revealed preferences. Revealed preferences certainly will tell you at least how much people value something. Because if you're willing to drive to go see it, then that's a lower bound. That's at least how much you value it. But we still haven't been able to figure out, maybe if you lived another 50 miles away, you also would have driven there, right? So you could value it more than you're actually showing. And it also doesn't necessarily include the non-use values. So I may never travel to Yellowstone, but just the idea that it exists, knowing that it's there, has some value to me. Knowing that I have the option of going after I retire, knowing that my kids could go one day, has some value to me. So those things aren't necessarily measured in the revealed preferences. So really, there's not an excellent way to value environmental resources, things that maybe are, as we've discussed in previous chapters, a public good or a common resource good that people don't have a market incentive. There's not a market for it where we buy and sell and we can actually see people's values by the prices they're willing to pay for things. It's tough to figure out what people's value actually is, but it's again an important exercise. It's certainly important to try to figure these things out because there are lots of policy implications and applications for figuring out the value of a resource.